But also, the trust bound, we can never promise more than h. R minus pi and R can't be more than h. The important thing, I'm going to let tau, two important more definitions. I gave you the parameters, tau and g. Tau is the flow of benefits divided by how gamma epsilon is the hidden benefit from corruption. Beta minus alpha times epsilon, that's the increase in probability of the penalty being applied. The penalty has to be greater than or equal to that ratio. The no corruption constraint, incentive constraint, the basic governor's moral hazard constraint, basically mathematical equivalent to the penalty has to be at least tau. And it's going to be in everything. You never penalize more than tau, otherwise you're just creating needless risk. Even without risk aversion, you don't want it. One penalty, the key is now, R minus pi has to be bigger than D, so R, how much we promise the governor, if things go well, has to be at least pi plus D, but pi is at least tau, so D, the rebellion payoff plus the minimal penalty for crisis, the governor, at the end of a good period, has to be expecting at least G. D plus tau. And of course, if the prince is trust bound, the moral hazard constraint on the prince is here. If the prince is trust bound isn't G, then we can't, the problem is infeasible. But if H is at least G, then we're fine. The solution, here I shouldn't spend much time on, the recursive optimality conditions are long. The top part of this is just what we already saw. Underneath it is, let's see, if we V0 is if we dismiss a governor, we can choose how much to pay the new governor, what to give the new governor if things are good, or how much to penalize if it's bad. And V of U is the leader's minimal expected future. At the end of the period, what's the expected discounted future costs for the prince when he promises the incumbent governor at the end of the period U? So that amount, there's no cost at the end of the period. So at the beginning of this period, this must be the expected discounted value, and that's, well, we're either going to have R or R minus pi credit next period, at the end of the period. If we don't, I'm sorry, we're this line. R or 1 minus R period. We're getting an income of K, which in cost accounting is a negative, but we may be paying on epsilon Y. That's V0, but for the real case, where that's subject to 2 to 4, we don't have a promise-keeping constraint if we appoint a new governor. In the real problem, that's equal to the same minimization, but there's also a probability of dismissal where we get the V0, and otherwise we get pretty much the same thing times 1 minus Q if we don't dismiss. What's the optimal policy? The optimal policy, it's all described down at the last 4 lines. There is something with that's slightly less than G and H that depends on epsilon, G, forget what those are, it doesn't matter. The important thing is the new governor, you don't pay a new governor. What you do is you promise the new governor that if things go well, she'll get the G, and if not, she gets G minus tau, which is the D, the rebellion payoff. For an incumbent governor, if the incumbent governor has a credit less than G, like D, near D, because there was a penalty last period, then you don't pay him, of course. You don't pay her, of course. 1 minus Q is going to be U over G epsilon. It's going to be U over a little less than G. What's that? That's saying you're going to be retained. 1 minus Q is the probability of being retained, and get essentially G with high probability, unless you, and we're going to randomize between dismissing you or retaining you. If you retain, you'll end up with G or G minus tau, depending on whether there's a crisis or not. In between, we still have it. We're not, Y is 0, Y is 0. Y is going to be 0 until we're very close to H. We backload the wages as much as possible. Once the credit gets above G, we don't dismiss. But the credit is going to increase over time. How much is it increasing by? The rate is delta U. That's the interest rate times what was owed. We're paying we're saying, no, we owe you an interest on the credit we owe you, and we'll just add that to your credit. And also, you're being exposed to a risk of a penalty, tau, with probability epsilon alpha. We'll add that to your credit. We're not paying you anything. We're just increasing your credit. This state variable is increasing. When it finally hits H, then we start paying, because we can't let your credit go up anymore. So we're backloading as much as possible. The same thing is said maybe better here. If you take the continuous time limit of the optimal policy as epsilon goes to 0, what we do is we don't pay you anything, and the credit is going to grow at a stochastic rate u prime equals delta u. That's the, we're adding to your account the interest on what we already owe you, plus we're adding to the rate at which you're being exposed to penalty risks. When there's a crisis, then, which happens with this alpha rate, your credit drops by tau, and otherwise it's continuously going up at this rate. This is between crises. Every time there's a crisis, you drop by tau. New governors start a credit G, and you don't get paid until your credit hits the upper bound when you don't trust the prince anymore. Then you're paid the interest on what you're owed plus the exposure to penalty, and your credit stays at H until there's a crisis, and that's it. Backloading to the maximum. The middle part I should skip because this is how much it takes to actually compute the value function for the prince in this optimal solution. Let me say I'm very proud that I can do this in an Excel spreadsheet that's available on my webpage. But the bottom line is that given the parameters, v of u, it's strictly convex, function of u greater than or equal to g, increase, and furthermore, holding other parameters constant, if you increase the prince's trust bound, you strictly decrease the prince's ex-ante expected cost according to this formula where psi is defined by a certain differential equation over here. These two lines define what psi is. And that's the mathematical result. The fact, what's going on here? Look, the prince incurs a liability G. That's the rebellion payoff, which is a huge amount. The possibility of looting a province is very valuable. Most people, and plus there's this penalty we have to impose on prices. So G is D plus tau, the penalty. And when you appoint somebody governor, you, the prince, you have to give them an incentive plan that has that expected present discount value G. What you could do, and you should not do, but you could do, is contract with, let's say, a proverbial Swiss bank. It's still good. And you give the Swiss bank that also has discount rate delta could, this is not a good idea, when you appoint a new governor, you, the prince, could give G to the Swiss bank. The Swiss bank will then pay money according to the policy to the governor when appropriate, which isn't going to happen until, according to the rules of the stochastic process, the prince's credit has reached the governor's credit has reached the upper bound H. But the Swiss, there's several Swiss banks, and they're competing, so they're just indifferent. They're making zero expected profit, and they're willing to do it. But you, the prince, can only collect K. This is a huge amount of money because there's a lot of power being a governor, and your candidates can't pay anywhere near that amount, so they're paying a small amount. So you're losing G minus K every time you appoint a governor. But now that the Swiss bank has taken care of the intermediate payoffs, we can see what your princely costs are. You're trying to minimize the expected present discounted value of these G minus K losses that happen every time you roll it over. So your goal is to minimize the expected turnover rate. The leader has basically two policies. One is, with high debt, what's happening is suspending pay. The governor doesn't get paid until the credit reaches H, and then if she's bad and there's a crisis, which should be caused by her misbehavior, her credit drops, and that's essentially a suspension of pay. So the threat of suspension of pay now or in the near future is one incentive. The other incentive at the low end, when they're far from is the threat on the low end of being fired, of being dismissed. It's the dismissal that is where the cost is.